Let's start with the truth. Medieval castles were cold, not just a little chilly, but freezing to the point where you could see your breath while standing inside. These buildings were never meant to be warm or cosy. Their main purpose was defense. They were made to withstand sieges, protect nobles, and keep enemies out. Comfort was never part of the design. There was no central heating, no radiators, no soft duvets filled with feathers, just stone walls, open spaces, and the constant struggle to stay warm. So the big question is, how did people sleep in these drafty fortresses without turning into ice themselves? When we picture a castle today, we often imagine candlelight glowing on tapestries, grand banquets in the halls, or nobles wrapped in fur robes. But the real picture was very different. At night, most castles were bitterly uncomfortable, especially during winter. Behind those thick stone walls was a world colder than the forests outside. There was no insulation, no glass windows, just raw stone and endless drafts sneaking in through every crack. Sleeping in a medieval castle wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. The first and biggest problem was the material itself. Castles were made of stone. Stone was perfect for defense. It didn't burn, it didn't break easily, and it could withstand enemy attacks. But stone also absorbed cold and held it for a long time. Once the walls froze, they stayed that way for days. Imagine being surrounded by walls 10 feet thick with a high ceiling above you and small windows letting in the wind. The floors were bare stone, hard and icy, echoing with every step. The design of castles only made things worse. Great halls were huge and impossible to keep warm. Bedrooms were often high in towers where the wind hit hardest. Spiral staircases acted like funnels, pulling cold air straight into living spaces. The only things keeping out the drafts were heavy wooden doors and, if you could afford them, thick tapestries. Castles were built to keep enemies out to ear, but never to keep heat in. It wasn't just the stone. The way castles were designed allowed the cold to spread everywhere. Rooms were connected by open hallways, which meant drafts could travel through easily. Courtyards in the centre let the wind flow directly into the heart of the building. At night, when the fires burned low, the cold crept in like an unwanted guest, quiet, unstoppable, and everywhere at once. The only way to fight the cold was with fire. In the best case, a room might have an open hearth, a large stone fireplace. Otherwise, there was only a small fire pit in the middle of the floor. But fires weren't very effective. They filled the air with smoke and only warmed the space right in front of them. Large stone rooms with tall ceilings stayed cold no matter how bright the flames were. And before chimneys became common in the 12th century, smoke didn't even escape properly. It just drifted upward, hanging in the room until it slowly found a way out through the roof or walls. The wealthy sometimes used chamber hearths or braziers, metal bowls filled with hot coals. These helped a little, but they were dangerous. A brazier could easily tip and cause a fire. In poorly ventilated rooms, the smoke from coals could be deadly. People didn't always die from the cold. Sometimes they died from the very smoke meant to warm them. Still, a glowing brazier or crackling fire gave at least a few hours of relief, enough to take off your boots, crawl into bed, and hope to make it till morning. The strongest defense against the cold wasn't the fire, it was the bed. Those four-poster beds with curtains weren't just for decoration, they were practical survival tools. Imagine a small tent inside a freezing stone room. That's what these beds became once the heavy curtains were pulled shut. They trapped body heat inside and kept the cold air outside. The wealthy went a step further, lining the curtains with wool or fur for extra insulation. Some even used thick felted blankets that worked almost like rugs. Beds were raised off the ground, sometimes a few feet, to escape the icy drafts that slid across the floor. Mattresses were sacks stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool. Not exactly comfortable by our modern standards, but they kept the sleeper warm and, most importantly, dry. And people didn't sleep alone. Families often doubled or tripled up in one bed. Children slept together, servants shared with the servants, and everyone curled up tightly. It wasn't about stretching out in comfort, it was about containing body heat. Knees tucked in, arms wrapped around yourself, pressed close to others. Once you were inside that cocoon of warmth, you stayed there until daylight. If you were noble, you had help. Servants were the hidden heroes of a warm bedchamber. They started preparing the room hours before bedtime. Fires were lit, braziers filled, and flat stones heated in the flames before being tucked into mattresses to pre-warm them. Boiling water was poured into metal bottles or ceramic jugs wrapped in cloth and slid beneath the blankets, a medieval version of hot water bottles. Blankets were piled on thick. Sheets, if available, were smoothed. Extra coverings were folded at the foot of the bed. Everything was arranged so the master and mistress could climb into as much warmth as possible, and the servants didn't stop once their lords fell asleep. They often stayed in the room all night, sitting by the fire, refilling braziers, adding log, or bringing more hot water if needed. Their job was to make sure the noble didn't wake up shivering in the dark. In many cases, a noble's comfort was built on the constant work of 3 or 4 attendants who barely slept themselves. At first glance, nobles seemed to have the advantage: bigger beds, thicker blankets, fires in their chambers, and personal attendants, but castle architecture played tricks on them. Their rooms were often high in towers, farther away from the ground's natural warmth and more exposed to harsh winds. Large windows were built to display wealth and power, but these windows rarely had glass. At best, there were wooden shutters or thin-oiled cloth coverings. So even though nobles had the best resources, their rooms could still be colder than the servant quarters below. Meanwhile, some servants actually slept warmer. They often lay near the kitchens or in small inner rooms where the walls held daytime heat. Others curled up near livestock in the stables, sharing body heat with cows, horses, or goats. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Warmth in castles didn't always follow wealth. Sometimes location mattered more than luxury. If you think sleeping inside a freezing castle was tough, imagine not sleeping at all. That was the life of the guards. While nobles curled up in curtained beds and servants huddled near kitchens, the guards stood outside on the ramparts, in towers, and at the gates. Their job was to stay awake, stay alert, and stay alive. They didn't have braziers, beds, or heavy furs. Most wore mismatched layers of rough wool, wrapped themselves in cloaks, and braced against the icy wind. The cold on those battlements was merciless. How did they cope? By moving constantly. Guards stamped their feet, swung their arms, and paced back and forth to keep blood flowing. Sometimes they huddled together, like birds clustering for warmth. A few carried heated stones wrapped in cloth beneath their cloaks. Others sipped strong wine or ale, not to get drunk, but to dull the biting cold. Alcohol didn't warm the body, but it made the hours feel less unbearable. And they couldn't afford to fail. Falling asleep on duty could mean punishment, even death. Because if a guard froze or dozed off and an enemy slipped in, the entire castle could be lost. For them, cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a constant test of loyalty and survival. The big question again: how did people sleep in medieval castles without freezing to death? The truth is, they barely did. They survived with layers of wool and fur. They slept packed tightly in groups. They built smoky fires, hauled hot sartan stones into beds, and pulled curtains shut to trap every drop of warmth. Nobles relied on servants to prepare and maintain their rooms. Common folk and servants leaned on kitchens, livestock, or each other. Guards fought the cold by never stopping, never resting. And even then, not everyone made it. Winters claimed lives. Fevers worsened in the cold. Weakness or age could turn a chill into a death sentence. Exposure was as deadly as any blade. Yet people endured. They adapted. They found ways to push through the nights, wrapping themselves in wool, in rituals, in shared warmth, and passing those survival tricks from one generation to the next. So the next time you pull a blanket over your shoulders or turn up the heat, think of them. Somewhere hundreds of years ago, a man or woman lay inside a freezing stone room, their breath rising in white clouds, smoke filling their lungs, praying for the sun to rise. They made it through not because they were warm, but because they were determined.